in North America here in a second. Does anybody have any business to cover first, or any questions or anything like that? Okay, all right. So let's get going. Let's start with American elk. Elk. What's that other word before American elk? Anybody know?
Probably what the natives used to call them.
That's right. The Native American term for them. And this is a species that we used to have in Tennessee. We lost it. We brought them back several years ago. So we have a couple populations in East Tennessee now. And why are you not? Wait, I think I missed something. Is it gonna be that kind of a day? Okay, range map and then the life history stuff. So the historic range of the species included 5 subspecies, okay? The eastern elk covered all of eastern North America. That subspecies is extinct, okay? We hunted it to extinction. Last one in Tennessee was killed, I think, in 1886 in Obion County. But the other ones are still there. So you have the Rocky Mountain, the Manitoban used to be over a good bit of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, and then you get the Rocky Mountain elk east of the Rocky Mountains, and then the Roosevelt elk on the coast. This is Canada, this is Washington and Oregon, California. So the Roosevelt elk was on the coast. Down here is called the T-U-L-E, that's pronounced Thule, the Thule elk, okay? It's a smaller elk. And then farther south was the Merriam's elk. Today we have a very different looking distribution, don't we? We have, let's see, the eastern elk is extinct. And sorry, they changed the colors, so that makes it kind of confusing. But here's the Rocky Mountain elk. Here's the Manitoban elk, just little patches left. The Roosevelt elk is still on the coast. Little fragments of the Thule elk left in California. The Rocky Mountain elk is what has been transplanted in a lot of places. Now, this map is several years old, so it doesn't show that several eastern states have transplanted elk. Kentucky was one of the first. Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, moved into North Carolina. So they're in several eastern states now, small populations of a few hundred to a few thousand. Tennessee, we have them in one primary place, and that's north of Knoxville on the North Cumberland Wildlife Management Area, where they were introduced around 150. Today, we think there's somewhere in the 400, 500 range, just a few hundred. There's a small hunt held each year on those elk in Tennessee. They were also introduced into the North Carolina side of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park by the National Park Service. Those were introduced into the Cataloochee Valley, and those have spread out, and some of them occasionally make their way into Tennessee just a little bit, but there's not as many there. They're way up in the mountains. So these eastern elk transplants almost all of them came from a national park in Canada called Elk Island National Park. It's in Alberta, Canada. And Elk Island is large, fenced in, and that population of elk is very heavily monitored for diseases and such. And they produce a surplus of elk. It's an unhunted population. So they've been kind of an elk factory for a lot of the eastern states. We don't have our own subspecies anymore. It's extinct. So that was one of the nearest subspecies that we could get to. So that's what we have now. Good. So elk is a big animal, about 500 to 1,000 pounds. And let me take just a minute for a couple of you who may or may not be familiar with these terms that we use to describe mating systems, okay? So wildlife mating systems can include a few different terms. One is monogamy, and that's when one male mates with one female. You see this in wolves, you see it in waterfowl, and several other species of bird. And then next you have polygamy. And polygamy can happen one of two ways. The most common we see in vertebrates, the one we see in vertebrates, is polygyny, and the other one is polyandry. Okay, poly means more than one, multiple. Gynous refers to female, androus refers to male. So multiple females means one male mates with more than one female, typically the more mature or dominant males. Polyandry means one female might mate with more than one male. We don't see that as much in vertebrates. We see it sometimes in invertebrates, and there's some fascinating research going into whether some female invertebrates are able to detect which male it mates with, it has more fit genes, and fertilize the egg with those genes. But we don't typically see that in the vertebrates. And then the third one is, I always forget this term, is promiscuity. And this is when there's indiscriminate mating. Each individuals of each sex might mate with multiple individuals of other sex. We see that in the felids, typically in the cats. Okay, so most of our ungulates, our deer and elk and moose and sheep and goats and such are polygamous, or specifically polygynous, where a few dominant males are the only males that mate with all the females that are mature. So they typically have one young, sometimes two. Their habitat and diet is semi-open forest and grassland. They're usually grazers. And I could also use the term browser. A grazer is grazing on grass and forbs. A browser is grazing on tree branches, okay? Now, some subspecies of elk will also browse. For example, the Roosevelt elk over in the Coast Range of Oregon and Washington, they live in dense forests, and they'll browse as well as graze. So elk are doing great. There's no concern. They're a very popular game species. Good? All right. Y'all feel free to jump in with any questions, okay? All right. Most popular game species in North America right here is the white-tailed deer. It is widely distributed over North and Central America, and there are over 36 subspecies of white-tailed deer. You don't have to memorize any of them. If you like, you can know. Does anybody know the name of Tennessee's subspecies here in the southeast? It's the Virginia white-tailed deer, Virginia. Odocolis virginiana, I think Virginiana. And I bet the one subspecies that everybody also knows is right down here at the very tip of Florida. The key deer. Yeah, those little bitty guys. Yeah. So a very widely distributed animal, very popular game species all across North America. 50 to 400 pounds. They tend to be smaller in the south and larger in the north. What's the ecological rule that refers to? Yeah, Bergman's rule is that individuals of a species or group tend to be larger as they get closer to the poles. And it has to do with conserving heat where it gets colder. The bigger animals can have more of a volume to surface ratio. They're also polygamous, 1 to 2 young, and they range widely. Forests, wetlands, very, very typically early successional habitats. They're both grazers and browsers. They're a relatively R-selected species, and R-selected means they have a lot of young, they reproduce quickly, they mature very quickly, and so they can bounce back from heavy hunting pressure pretty quickly. They're doing great, least concern. So the mule deer and black-tailed deer, this is the same species, but there are a few different subspecies of them. So you have about, I forget how many, 8 or 9 subspecies in all. These shaded ones are the black-tailed deer subspecies. Number 8 is the Colombian black-tailed deer in the Coast Range and Sierra Nevadas. And number 9, up in British Columbia and southern Alaska, is the Sitka black-tailed deer. The rest of them are all subspecies of the mule deer. The black-tailed deer subspecies tend to be smaller. They tend to be more like the size of a white-tailed deer. When I was a student at Oregon State, a lot of the wildlife students would hunt black-tailed deer on the river that ran right by Corvallis. The river was a wide, kind of fast-moving, shallow river. We would go in drift boats, and there would be a lot of islands that might be a quarter of a mile long, a half mile long, or two or 300 yards wide. And so you take a drift boat with 2 or 3 people in it, drop off a couple, take the boat down to the bottom, and we would drive the islands. And had about 50% of the folks would get deer on those hunts. It was really fun. But you would be driving these islands, walking through really dense undergrowth. Every now and then, while you'd stop to wait for one of the other guys to catch up 20 feet away, once or twice I saw black-tailed deer crawling, trying to go between us, 20 feet away, looking up at me. Just really sneaky little guys, nothing like you would see around here. So really a fascinating species. So their weight ranges widely. The black-tailed deer, might be smaller. The mule deer can get good size. They're polygamous as well, usually 2 young. They're generalists, browsers, and grazers. Least concern. Let me go back to the antlers. Notice well, you can't. Sorry, that doesn't really show it. In white-tailed deer, typically, antlers will fork off the main beam. But usually you don't see a secondary fork in white-tailed deer. Sometimes, but not usually. This is more common in mule deer. So if you see that secondary fork, that's one of the more common traits of a mule deer. Okay, caribou, reindeer. This is one of those species that in many cultures around the world has been domesticated. In northern Canada, Alaska, many native tribes, as well as other northern countries in Europe and Eurasia. Many of these individuals are farmed, domesticated, and very common popular meat. If you go up to Alaska, it's very common to find caribou meat for sale. So I'm not going to make you worry about that really confusing looking map of the ranges. What I want to point out is that in Canada, some of the populations are sedentary in the boreal forest, the northern coniferous forest, and some of the populations are migratory. And they migrate north out of the forest into the tundra, where their calving grounds are, where they get farther away from the wolves. And if there are wolves up there, they can more easily see the wolves from a distance. And then they'll migrate back down into the forest in the winter where they're more protected. So some are migratory, some are sedentary, but they tend to be a very northern species, and that's a species that's have been of some concern. 150 to 600 pounds. They get a good bit bigger. They are polygamous as well, 1 to 2 young. They live in the taiga, that's the northern coniferous forest, and they also live north of the taiga in the tundra, where they eat lichens. There's a lot of lichens in the tundra, and they browse on tree limbs, willow and alder and others. They're considered vulnerable. And another note is that most females have antlers, just like the males. So that's unlike white-tailed deer, which sometimes you see females with antlers, but seldom. Okay, the moose, Alces is a big old honking ungulate. These are the subspecies. Don't worry about memorizing these subspecies of the moose, but you see that this is a northern species. Its range dips down into the United States in the northeastern New England states, a little bit in the Great Lakes states, and through the Rocky Mountains. Otherwise, it's all over Canada, northern Canada, and Alaska. These guys get big, 600 to 1,200 pounds. polygamous, 1 to 2 young. Moose have very long legs, and they're adapted to heavy snow conditions and to water. So you often see them in and around streams and northern lakes, and they browse on aquatic vegetation and trees along it. The conservation status is considered least concern, but this is a more K-selected species than the white-tailed deer. They don't have as many young. They don't survive quite as well. So the hunting is more restricted than it is for our white-tailed deer. American bison, we all know, bison. Once upon a time, its range was, all over the interior of North America, all the way up into Alaska, but its range was restricted by the 19th century, the 1800s, to the plains and the eastern Rocky Mountains. And today, of course, we just have a small population scattered here and there. 800 to 2,000 pounds. Polygamous, usually 1 young. Desert and open woodland, we used to have them in Tennessee, the woods bison. They're primarily grazers. They'll browse a little where they live in the woods. They're near threatened, so their populations, are probably never going to be what they once were. We do some harvest to control their populations. There's concerns, for example, about the bison when they reach high populations in Yellowstone National Park that have contracted brucellosis at times. They can spread that to livestock. So there's ranchers that are, that are concerned about disease potential. People always forget the muskox. That's way north. But this is one of those species that is native to North America, and it has, like the caribou, what we call a circumpolar distribution. They're in all the continents around the North Pole, but they're much more restricted, closer to the North Pole. Far northern Alaska, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Seward Peninsula, northern Canada, the Bering Sea, Greenland, Russia, so all these countries around the Arctic Circle, we have them. In the past, they've been, yeah, go ahead.
So circumpolar distribution just means it's around all the countries that are near the poles.
Yeah, we're near the North Pole specifically. Yeah. And let's see. We in the past we exploited them heavily. Their populations went down, but in the past half a century or so, we've been gradually putting them back into some places where they had been extirpated. So they're doing fine, but they are largely protected. They're a K-selected species, much more than these others. 500 to 900 pounds, polygamous, usually 1 young every other year. They're living in an extreme environment, so resources are limited, so we really have to be careful with regard to hunting pressure. They're browsers and grazers, and they're doing fine, but we are protecting. That's one of those neat species. How do northern bobwhite roost at night? Does anybody know about the roost configuration at night? They roost on the ground in a circle. A covey will roost in a circle with all the birds facing outward, so that if a predator comes, there's always eyes who will be able to see it. And these muskox, when they're attacked by wolves, they do the same thing. They circle up facing outward and protect the young in the middle of the circle, which is a pretty cool social adaptation. Anybody ever seen a mountain goat? Cool.
We looked for them.
You looked for them and didn't see. Oh, yeah, okay, excellent. I've been fortunate to see mountain goats in Oregon and Alaska and a couple other places. They're a really fascinating species. Their range in North America is primarily in British Columbia. It gets a little bit into Alberta, on up into southeastern Alaska. It comes down into the Cascades of Washington and in the Rocky Mountains of Montana and Idaho, and maybe just a little bit on down into like Colorado and Utah. The bighorn sheep can get pretty good size, 100 up to 300 pounds. They're polygamous, 1 to 2 young, and they live in alpine environments. And some of you just learned what alpine is exactly the other day. What is alpine?
So how the trees don't grow.
Yeah, so high in the mountains that trees don't grow, so they live primarily above the tree line. It's a species of least concern. Bighorn sheep in past decades were transplanted to a few places. So they were, the people think, oh, they live in alpine. And here's alpine. So there was alpine in the Olympic Peninsula of Western Washington, right here, the Olympic National Park, right here on the Olympic Peninsula, had alpine but no mountain goats. So 100 years ago, wildlife biologists trapped and moved mountain goats in there, and a few decades later, they started recognizing that the species of plant there was not the same as the species in other places, and they were not adapted to that grazing, and the goat was changing the vegetative composition. So even though the goat's really, really popular, they realized, okay, it's an exotic here, it doesn't belong here. So, they're kind of trying to backstep those efforts to get rid of those goats. Okay, so we have two species of sheep native to North America, okay? The first is the Dall sheep. And there are two primary subspecies of the Dall sheep. And one is called the Dall sheep, and one is called the stone sheep, okay? These tend to be more north, mostly in Canada and Alaska. The Dall sheep are sometimes also called the thin-horn sheep, okay? Here's the range, and this showed once upon a time the Kenai, a third subspecies, on the Kenai Peninsula called the Kenaiensis. But the primary two we have today are the Ovis dalli, the Dall subspecies, and the Ovis dalli stonei, the stone sheep, the stone subspecies. Okay, so you notice they're Alaska, Yukon Territory, and northern British Columbia. So they're far north. So the ones we have down here in the lower 48 states is the other sheep. We'll get to that in a second. So the Dall sheep is 125 to 200 pounds, polygamous, 1 to 2 young. They live in the mountains, usually not in the alpine. So they'll intermix with mountain goats, but you see them down amongst the trees a lot more often, and even on down out of the mountains at lower elevations. There's the species of least concern, but we manage them very, very carefully. These species are trophy species. So we hunt them with quota hunting only, no open seasons, and people pay a lot of money for when those tags go up for auction. The colors can vary for both Dall sheep and bighorn sheep, the other species, from brown to white. Okay. And this is the bighorn sheep. The horns tend to be bigger, thicker. The Dall sheep have large horns too. But they ranged historically, all over the Intermountain West, from the Rocky Mountains to the Cascades and Sierra Nevada. They were not much of a coastal subspecies, although they have occurred as far south as Baja California in Mexico. What you see now is that they're still all over the West, the Intermountain West, but in much smaller patches. So they're managed in small fragmented populations. They're managed intensively. The way that most states and Canadian provinces handle quota hunting is they'll determine for this little population how many can we afford to have hunted this year. They'll issue that many tags, and usually the success rate is pretty high because people really, really, really pursue them heavily. And if they say, okay, we can afford to harvest 5 or 10 out of this population this year, they'll just put your name into a drawing for those tags, except for the last one, which they'll auction off. And those auctions can get, people might pay $12,000, $20,000, $100,000, $200,000, $350,000, right? A lot of money, over $250,000 in multiple instances. These are, of course, wealthy people who think of themselves as sports people and philanthropists, because that money goes back into managing the bighorn sheep. So they feel like, hey, I'm getting an opportunity of a lifetime, and I'm helping the population. I have this money to spend on. This is what I want to spend it on. How much would you spend, Logan?
Nowhere close.
So 125 to 275 pounds, polygamous, 1 to 2 young, mountain grazers and browsers. Least concern, but we manage them intensively.
I will say, when I did the governor's hunt for the turkeys in Tennessee,
Mm-hmm.
they have the banquet at the end, and I've seen hunts like that go for like 50, 75,000.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
a regular auction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I got up and walked out. No, I did stay and watch
gotta
it
get
just to
one.
see how much money was
Right.
going out.
Yeah.
It was pretty cool.
Who has seen bighorn sheep? You saw them this summer?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we saw probably like 10 of them. They're
Nice.
weird looking.
Very good. Yeah, they have wild looking eyes. Their eyes look really wild. Where did you see them?
Oh, my family took a trip like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And got to see them.
Awesome.
Rocky Mountain National Park.
Oh yeah, I've seen them there.
We parked and got on the side. We saw them from the road. So we got on the hill under them and snuck up on them and got within 20 yards. of
Ah,
them.
nice,
Some
I
nice.
just walked right up to the car.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they were looking in the window trying to get food.
In some places they're pretty tame. In other places they're very wild. But yeah. Interesting. Cool. So cool. Neat animals. Okay, so we often call them antelope or pronghorn antelope. Taxonomically, they are not actually an antelope. So the proper term for them is a pronghorn. Proper term for a Canadian goose is a Canada goose. The proper term for a bobwhite quail is a northern bobwhite, right? So we're working on that terminology. So this is a pronghorn. Fascinating little species. Bet several of you have seen pronghorn. Widely distributed across the western United States. Their original range is in light gray. Their current range is in dark gray, so it's a lot smaller than it used to be, but still not as fragmented as those bighorn sheep. Still lots and lots of them. They're a smaller animal, 75 to 130 pounds. They're polygamous, usually have a couple of young. They're very fast runners. They are adapted to arid conditions. They're more adapted to desert conditions than a lot of these other big game in the western states. They're grazers, they're doing great. They're a species of least concern. They're relatively R-selected. Their horns are not true horns. Their horn sheath is made of keratin and it sheds each year. So the females have that horn as well. Both male and female have the pronghorn. And I think one of the homework questions asks you to distinguish resource defense polygyny and harem defense polygyny. So this might come into play as an example of one of them. Elk exhibit harem defense. This might be resource defense. Yeah.
Something I learned this summer, apparently, looking at them, I expect them to jump over stuff, but apparently go under everything.
Isn't that wild?
They said, because my buddy in Nebraska, he said the fences there have to be a minimum of 11 inches off the ground. Because they said they'll just run and slide right under the fence and keep on running.
Right.
He said it's pretty weird to watch.
It is. And it's kind of fascinating that there's been a lot of research on what fence works best to stop a cow, but to allow different species of wildlife to pass through. So based on what species you have, that dictates how high on national forest and BLM land and state lands, how high and far apart your fence strands are and which ones have barbed wire and don't, because every species has a tendency that's a little bit different. So it's kind of fascinating.
A lot of them there in Arizona too have PVC pipe type things on the top, so the elk could jump over.
They don't just jump over, they don't get caught up.
Getting caught on them.
Yeah, cool. Very good. Very good. All of our favorites, the invasive wild boar, feral pig, Sus scrofa. This is the same species as the domestic pig, Sus scrofa. If you let loose a domestic pig in the wild, Give it a few generations, it'll get the elongated snout and the coarse hair and the tusks. We've just bred that out with the domestic pig because we're growing them for bacon, for meat. But it doesn't, we're not too many generations removed from that ancestral pig. As of last year, feral swine populations this is what they're looking like. We anticipate that that's just going to continue because climate changes it favors the pig. It doesn't do as well in heavy snows. So as we have milder winters, we expect that that's going to continue to a degree. In Tennessee, I'll talk about this more in a couple of days. In Tennessee, we had a population in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the Cherokee National Forest that came primarily from the Vanderbilt estate that used to have pigs. They decided to get rid of them. They had a big hunt and a drive. They killed as many as they could. The rest of them ran through the fence and got out. And in between that and just domestic pigs that were allowed to free range and went feral, that resulted in a well-established population in the park and the forest we never could get rid of. So there's a lot of hunters in East Tennessee that love hunting both bear and pigs. We had a student from Polk County several years ago in the wildlife program, and other people would say, well, what do you hunt over there in East Tennessee? And he said, barn hog. And so that became his name, Barn Hog. And he's back in East Tennessee hunting bear and hog now. But we managed them as a game species, TWRA, Tennessee Game and Fish and TWRA, for many decades. And they actually got put in a couple other places, Catoosa and a couple other places. And over time, they started expanding out and causing more damage in other places. So TWRA decided that we need to manage them more carefully, try to control them more. And around that time, people who were enthusiastic hunters of pigs started recognizing that, okay, they're being controlled more, so they're becoming more valuable to people who like to hunt them. So a lot of hunters started trapping them and moving them to other places. And that's where you see them in Land Between the Lakes and lots of other places. When we tried to control them is when they blew up. And it was because of unethical hunters that were moving them everywhere. At that point in time, it was happening all over the Southeast. All the state wildlife agencies were talking, how do we control these pigs? The only two states that were having success was Kansas and Nebraska. They had pigs and they managed to knock them out. And all the other states asked them, how did you do it? And they said, we outlawed hunting and we trapped them. And we worked with the landowners who didn't want them because they were doing damage to their property. And we trapped them. We said it can't be a game species. We had to take away the market. We had to take away, the attractiveness of hunting. So you can't hunt them anymore. So that's what TWRA did. They said, okay, this is no longer a game species. You can't hunt it. If you're a landowner, we'll let you shoot them, and you can get permits to like up to 10 other people. But they were trying to find that balance between giving landowners, empowering them to get rid of their pigs, but not giving them enough permits so that they could start selling them to people and making a profit. And that's worked a little, but it hasn't worked a lot.
We ran into a lot of that in Arkansas because we were working at night, so a lot of times people were coming down into the WMAs where we were working, and they were trying to look for alligator, trying to go and look for frog. They were going out there frog gigging and stuff, but they would ask us what we were doing. We'd kind of tell them, and they'd be like, oh, we thought y'all were down here for hog stuff, because like they were still. Actual Arkansas Game and Fish were taking probably 80 to 100 and trapping them in one given spot on all kinds of WMAs, and we just tell the stakeholders, they're coming down there and they're like, we thought you were down here trapping our hogs, because it's still legal to hunt there.
Right.
So they're still having a lot of pushback with that.
It's a very controversial issue.
Yeah.
Do you think they were able to do that because of the different weather that they have? Their population may not have been so high.
That could be. There weren't very many when they started trying to control them. So the fewer there are, the easier it is. We started trying to control them once they were really well established and widely spread in heavy forest and mountain, which is a lot harder to do, so, yeah. I'll also tell you that when TWRA had the public meeting in East Tennessee to explain their new policies that included that we're no longer going to let this be a game species, they had to call in support of the sheriff and the city police because there were people who were making threats and coming in with handguns. really angry crowd. So they get up to 400 pounds, polygamous, 4 to 12 young, and can have more than 1 litter per year. They're generalist omnivores. Of course, non-concern, it's a huge pest, and even though some sportsmen, want them, our profession would love to get rid of them. Cause a lot of damage. We do have something that is a native, not quite a pig, but looks a little piggish, right? The collared peccary, or javelina. The collar, it gets its name from the collar of white fur around the neck. It's a much smaller animal down in the south, primarily in Mexico. But it comes up into Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. This is a little guy, about 40 to 50 pounds, polygamous, a couple of young. They live in desert country, desert and shrub. I was telling somebody, I forget who it was, that there's another term for shrub ecosystems, and that term is chaparral. Chaparral, yeah. But it's a species of least concern, a popular little game species down there. Then we have bears. The largest bear in the world is that Jacob's like, I've been waiting all day for this, finally. The largest of the bears, of course, is a polar bear, and we know that they too have a circumpolar distribution, including populations in Canada and Alaska and all the other countries bordering the Arctic Circle. 600 to 1,100 pounds, big animals. Polygamous, they usually have 2 young. Their habitat is ice flows and barren rocky shores and islands. Their primary diet is seals. They will often, wait and use an ambush style of hunting for a seal to come up to a hole to get air and attack it. But they're also omnivorous, so they'll eat, berries and other vegetation. It is a species considered vulnerable, partly due to past exploitation, partly due to changing environmental conditions in the Arctic due to melting ice and quickly shifting habitat. The brown bear is our next largest bear in North America. Tends to be a more northern species. It used to be all over the West. It's kind of hard to see that hatching. You can see the hatching looks a little bit heavier up in Canada, British Columbia, and in western Alberta, and on up into the northern provinces in Alaska. Little population around Yellowstone, Montana, northern Idaho. So not a lot of brown or grizzly bears in the lower 48 states, but a few. 325 to 1,500 pounds, big bear. Polygamous, usually 2 young. They live in mountains, forests. They live on the Pacific coast. Where they live on the coast, they frequently eat salmon when salmon are available, but they are generalist omnivores. They will scavenge, they will take deer and other mammals, large and small. The black bear, and I show you this to show you that throughout the range, there's a lot of color variation in black bear. In the southeast, we think of black bears as always being black, but this is a blonde black bear, on my study area in Oregon, at any given time, I usually had 6 or 7 black bears, and I could identify them from half a mile away, just my eyesight from the differences. This one had a honey-colored head. This one had, different colored paws or something sometimes. So there was a lot of variation in the color. This map is kind of weird. The dark gray and light gray historically show the past distribution. So they were continent-wide, except for the desert. If you look like at Nevada, they don't do well in the desert. But today, they're just where the dark gray is. So a little bit more. They're East Tennessee, and they have been working their way westward in Tennessee. They're as far west as Springfield, north of Nashville. There was one hanging out earlier this summer
around Woodbury, about 20-30 minutes from my parents outside of Murfreesboro.
They were throwing.
What's that?
Like all the people were throwing a tantrum because they were it was traveling from Murfreesboro down into Manchester and Woodbury. And
Yeah.
It come by
Facebook was going
like
like
our
crazy.
house.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, it was like
Cool.
10 minutes down the road.
Very cool,
The trail
yeah.
camera picture first started.
Yeah.
And then it went up into Franklin and all that, then it come back down, then it got hit and shoveled.
A
Yeah.
dude in my town shot one in self-defense. I wasn't there, I don't know the full story.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he got swept under the rug.
Okay. They are moving westward, so we'll see more and more. And of course, they're also in Arkansas, and we had one several years ago that swam the Mississippi River, and these animals will easily swim the Mississippi River, and came through Weakley County, just north of Martin. So, we might occasionally see more, over time. There's more and more people and less habitat, but black bears are fairly adaptive. Some people make the argument that black bears, don't they live in the mountains? Historically, we have lots of black bears here in West Tennessee. They like wetlands, swamps. They do very well in bottomland hardwood conditions. So, where we have large refuges like the Chickasaw and the Lower Hatchie and the Hatchie National Wildlife Refuges, Tully Wildlife Management Area, there could be large enough areas to support small populations of bears. So 200 to 475 pounds, polygamous, usually a couple of young, forests, swamps, mountains, widely omnivorous, all sorts of food. They're species of least concern. They're doing very well. I took a predator ecology class with Mike Pelton, who's a retired black bear ecologist at UT Knoxville back in the 1980s. And he took us into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and we were observing some bears foraging. And he was telling the story of taking a class a few years earlier. They were walking along a trail in the park, and there was dense rhododendron on either side of the trail. And the student asked, so how much do bears eat deer? And he said, hardly ever. It's really uncommon in this area. And it was just a few seconds after that a deer, they heard a bunch of crashing in the underbrush, and a deer came stumbling down and landed in the road, and a bear came flying off the slope and landed on the deer and drug it right back up into the woods. And he said, it's just the irony was kind of funny, but it's not the most common thing. They eat it's a lot easier for them to eat a lot more food, but they're opportunistic. They'll eat what they can get. Gray wolf, timber wolf, is one of the most controversial species of wildlife in the world, right? Think of all the children's tales, from Red Riding Hood to the Three Pigs to, the whole history of humankind has this fascination, this love and hate and fear and fascination relationship with gray wolves. Their range was once a good bit of North America. This line right here represented the southern boundary, okay? So they did not occur in most of the South, a good bit of the deep South, although they did occur in a good bit of Tennessee. Not West Tennessee, okay, but the rest of Tennessee. Now, this dotted line, I know this is really confusing, represents the northern boundary of the red wolf. So the red wolf was all over the southeast. The gray wolf and the red wolf ranges overlapped a little bit, we believe, right, in east and middle Tennessee, but just the red wolf here. So we had both of those species in Tennessee once upon a time. 70 to 120 pounds. And finally we get to a species that's monogamous. The wolves are monogamous. And they have elaborate social orders that are created through dominance hierarchies. So you know the story. There's an alpha male and an alpha female, that pair, beta male, all the way down. And usually those are extended families. Sometimes they allow other individuals into those groups, those packs. 6 to 7 young, forest, tundra, large and small mammals and birds. They're omnivorous. Overall, the species is doing fine. It's a species of least concern. It's actually hunted easily in Alaska, where it's doing very well. It has a complex history of being protected in the lower 48 states, where it was endangered, and as soon as it gets off the endangered species list, states like Wyoming and Idaho and Montana want to put it back on the list, or want to make it a game species. So the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service, says we need this many in order for it to be considered no longer endangered, and the states say our social carrying capacity is here. So as soon as they take it off the list, the states want to hunt it down to lower levels. And when they do, it would make it endangered again, so they have to put it on the list. So we're trying to find that sweet spot between what's a social carrying capacity and what's the minimum viable population size that would be considered stable. So it's very controversial, of course. The mountain lion, Felis concolor, or Puma concolor, sorry, used to be all over the lower 48 states, Mexico, and western Alaska, British Columbia. Today it's primarily in the west, except for the Florida panther. Okay, I'll just think several of you have heard my spiel on this. There's lots and lots of people, maybe including people in this room, who say, nope, Tennessee has mountain lion populations. And the response of the wildlife profession is, we do not have the evidence that we have mountain lion populations. We did have a mountain lion that came through Tennessee several years ago. The first person to get it on a trail camera was one of our wildlife students. And then it got on 2 more trail cameras, including video, and then somebody shot it with an arrow. It did not kill it, but that arrow had blood on it. They had the DNA analyzed, and they think it was an adult female from South Dakota or somewhere in that environment. And we never saw it again. Mountain lions are occasionally seen and sometimes shot in Missouri, Arkansas, and some of the other states. They've even gone as far as some of the southern New England states occasionally. And what we think those are is young animals, yearling animals, that are dispersing. They'll disperse long distances in all different directions, and sometimes they disperse eastward. And when they come this far, sometimes we see them. But the vast majority of claimants that we've got mountain lions in Tennessee, were able to either disprove that's a Labrador Retriever, that's a river otter, that's a bobcat, that's something else, or we don't know, provide us evidence.
So we've got a picture of one on a trail camera of
Okay.
a mountain lion. I'll have to see if my dad still's got the photo, 'cause I'm so curious if he does. But we've had one in Trenton.
Well, Trenton is not far from where our student got it on his trail camera. So was it a few years ago, several years ago?
It's been a few years ago, yeah.
It might have been that one. It might
That's
have
what
been
I
that
was
same
kind of
one.
thinking when you were describing it.
Yeah.
How long do you think it would take for a mountain lion to cover the difference between Idaho and Tennessee, for instance? That's like 1,000 miles. More.
They could do it pretty quickly. they could probably do it in. First of all, I have no idea, but I wouldn't be surprised if they could do it, easily within 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
That's great. Better than I can do.
Okay, so here are some places where sightings have been seen. Mountain lions do not come in black. Black is melanistic. Okay, that's a melanistic animal, and there has never been a mountain lion observed that's melanistic. There are 2 species of large cats that do occasionally occur in melanistic color phase, and that's leopards in Africa and Asia, and jaguars in South America, and they occasionally make their way into southern North America, okay? So they can be black, but not mountain lions. So the weight is 80 to 200 pounds. We're into the cats. They're promiscuous, okay? So indiscriminate breeders, 1 to 6 young, usually 2, mountains, forests, swamps. They are not omnivorous like wolves. They are carnivorous. They eat meat. They do not eat vegetation. Large and small mammals and birds, mostly deer. Their primary diet is deer. And the species overall is doing well. It's of the least concern. Jaguar, is this maybe our last one? This is a species that's much more common in Mexico, but we used to have it in the southern United States, in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, across Louisiana, and occasionally probably into southern Mississippi and Alabama and the panhandle of Florida. But today, it's not all over there. We have just a few places this is the Mexican border, where individuals
have been able to cross the border fence. So about half a dozen places where individuals have been able to cross the border fence into New Mexico and Arizona. Strengthening the border fence, ironically, keeps out more than one species of immigrant. It can easily keep out jaguars too. So ecologists have kind of scratched their head about how do we facilitate metapopulation dynamics in light of the immigration controversy. 150 to 225 pounds, a really big cat. They're promiscuous, 2 to 4 young, low mountains, chaparral, that's that shrubby habitat, open forest. They eat peccaries and other mammals. They're carnivores. They're considered near threatened, certainly threatened in the United States. And like I said, melanistic or black jaguars do exist, but not black mountain lions. There, that's what it looks like right there. Beautiful animal.
Why do you think that is? If like something can be, you know, have like
Melanistic?
albinism or, you know, something like that?
It's just genetics, chance genetics. It's just never happened to show up. I mean, there could be a mutation in the future, and mountain lions, you know, could become melanistic. But it's just chance mutation. Yeah.
Could
Good.
you say it'd be something similar to like zebras? They start losing their stripes because their genetic hasn't been varying enough. It's too similar. Could it be something like that? Or is it? Would you say it'd be more like deer and just happens like with the piebald and the?
Good question. I don't know. You know, they're widely distributed, and the more widely distributed they are, the more chance there is for genetic variation. So as they become less and less widely distributed, the chance for that natural variation is lower, but the chance for mutation is higher because you're having more inbreeding going on, right? All right, guys. Sorry I kept it in